Hello, everyone. My name is Aysegul, and I will talk to you about my adventures in Angular today. So a little bit about myself. I worked at Narwhal.io. We are a consulting company helping enterprise applications with their switch to Angular 1 to 2 or anything that they're building. And I'm a Google developer expert for web technologies and Angular. And you can find me on Twitter as Ice something. So, addition to doing consulting, we do have an open source project at Narwhal, which is Annex. I will tell you a little bit about it because it is all the things that we learned in the community that were very confusing and that were hard to do. We are trying to make it easy by extending Angular CLI. If you would like to follow along or have the slides as resource, you can follow it on bit.ly Angular Adventures, and I will post some examples to the repo. So today I want to tell you about the time-saving decisions that I didn't get to make because I started doing it very early on, and all of the mistakes that happened to me. And common confusions that I do see. I do teach a lot of Angular a lot, and I do speak a lot, so I get to see a lot of people's code, and there's so much information there. And some of the tools that would help you not to do those mistakes and be more efficient. So it's very hard for me to see, but how many people are already using Angular? Wow, pretty much everyone. That's great. So anyone still using Angular 1 or? Yes, great. So decision number one, upgrade versus rewrite. As a developer, I have this brand new tool. Angular was in alpha when I first proposed to rewrite one of our applications. At the time, I was working with Autodesk. And that was a huge application with lots of lots of state management issues, and it was really hard to work with, and it was very buggy. So rewriting seemed to be the right decision for everybody. But when you have a big application and when you have a lot of users, that's actually not really an option, we figured, because as the time goes by, there are lots of demands from the customers. There's new features, new bugs that you have to fix. So it was pushed aside, and then my rewrite was dead in I don't know, in a few months. And now it's even easier to be able to upgrade your existing Angular 1 applications to Angular 2 applications. I don't know if you're aware, but with the Angular 5, there's a new version of upgrade, which is much lighter and doesn't have a huge cost on your current Angular 1 applications in the library size. So I strongly recommend it. So TypeScript versus TypeScript. Anyone is writing JavaScript Angular applications? You are? OK. So this is almost like a no choice. Well, Angular documentation did give a version just writing plain JavaScript, but it is really not a very efficient way of doing it. Because Angular itself is written in TypeScript, and there are lots of developer productivity that you're using by not using TypeScript if you're not decide not to. One thing is the static type checking, which gives you some IDE support and being able to catch some errors before they ever happen. Basically, for any kind of API, you are defining what kind of arguments that it's expecting, and the IDE is able to tell you when your function that you wrote, like last month, you don't remember what kind of arguments it has, the IDEs are able to tell you what you need to put as an argument, which is really awesome. And it has the ES6 support. And the other thing that was very, very useful is when you're using somebody else's library, everybody does, and let's say we have D3 and we don't really remember what kind of arguments the methods that we wanted to use are taking. The types are much more up-to-date than any kind of documentation that you would see, because otherwise that they wouldn't pass the test. So defining types is not that complicated. It's everything that we know already. And most of the applications don't need anything very complicated. I mean, the most complicated thing I've ever done was to give an optional type to something. So you can define multiple types, and then you can say, depending, I might give back either or type to you in this function. So there's nothing to be afraid of. I mean, most people are saying, do I need to learn TypeScript now? There's not much of a learning curve if you're using the very basic thing. And it's very easy to enable just not to define the type and use it that way, but it's not a good idea. So when we started building application, Angular CLI was at the very, very beginning. So I went back and forth many times using Angular CLI and not to use Angular CLI. But years passed by, and Angular team had put a lot of effort into Angular CLI. And it is super optimized and very, very helpful tool. One thing that it's doing is it's helping you to create your application, bootstrap it, and create components and services and modules. But also, it is defining some build processes for you and internalizations. Can't say this. Recently, for one of our clients, I was able to test their Webpack configuration versus the Angular CLI. And although it was a very good configuration, Angular CLI builds half the size of a build. And also, the refresh time was optimized very much. And I tried to figure out, like, why did that happen? And the answer was, after reading lots of back and forth GitHub comments, was that Angular CLI team is working with Angular and also Webpack very closely, and they know how to optimize and what to optimize. So it's a very useful tool. And one of the other concerns for people was how hard it is to switch to Angular CLI if you haven't started with it. And there are a few things that you are going to change, but it's not very complicated. And what we do with NX is extending Angular CLI. So something that they recently published, Angular team recently published, is the Dev Toolkit. And it is allowing us and anybody to extend Angular CLI itself or go through the code and have access to the system and change files and configure files and write files and so many other things. So that's what we did. So we took Angular CLI and add more functionality to it. Anyone using GRL Store? No. This was one of the things that I was super confused about, to use or not to use GRL Store. If you don't know what it is allowing you to have a immutable data, global data, and store where you have all of your data interaction happens. So it's kind of a mind of, gives you a sanity. But at the time, there were not many applications that were using it. I wasn't sure if it's really necessary, and it was really hard to find out like when it's not necessary. So when do we not really need it? Why would we need it? It was kind of obvious, okay, it helps me with the state management, but also it's another tool that I have to learn, and my whole team has to learn. And that's a whole new bag of worms. But over time, what you end up doing is having to manage your data in your services and in your components, and the components have to communicate that data between each other, and the way you do it is by using maybe a subject observable in your service. And this sounds great, but what subject is an observable that you can also push some values into. So that means that data is being manipulated in more than one place. Some components are pushing to it, and some components are observing it, and it becomes very easily unmanageable over time. Kludge is one of my favorite words in English. It is basically just duct taping everything, and that's how we end up solving most of our problems when our data gets very complicated, our state management gets very complicated. And if you are not using a sane system like NGRX, you start from one component, and by the time you get to the end of it, you are not very sure, and you're not very sure what your state is. And it's really hard to figure out where the data has changed. Also, we have to keep the state in many places. We have to update our server, and we have to update our client and in the front end. So let's say we have a to-do list and we wanted to delete something or update something. We are not really sure if that update has happened unless our observables, our HTTP requests return back to us. And this is where most of our edge cases, most of our bugs happen. We think something is happening, but it's not really happening. And this is what we are trying to solve with NGRX. So Angular get rid of two-way data binding that gave us a little bit more sane API with the input and output. So our components are dispatching some events to start an action. And what Store is doing is taking that action and deciding how that action is going to affect and adds to it and makes the calls to our backend server, and finally keeps all of our data in a reducer where the state is immutable. So what actions are? Actions are intentions. They are when we say, okay, I want to change this thing, but it doesn't actually mean that that thing is going to happen. We are saying, okay, I wanted to delete this thing, but we don't know that deletion is going to happen unless our data in the backend server is also updated and our UI worked perfectly. So actions are deciding what our intentions are and then sending that intention to our store. Effects are unique to NGRX. They are not in the Redux concept, but that's where you are having some side effects. So basically, you have an action that is coming in, like deleting, and we have some action deciders. When this thing happens, just fire this other thing. And we can transform those actions. We can merge them together. We can listen for the last one, or we can wait all of them to happen. And that's where we do it also in effects classes. And then we create some side effects. The side effects would be calling our backend and then updating our permanent data. Once we have done that, effects will let us know this action has been successful, and then we can go to our reducer and then update our immutable state. If we step back a little bit, so this is how our component interactions happen. We have some inputs. In this case, we have a list of items that for our input that we wanted to repeat. And we can define some child components that have a output event with the parentheses. The delete is a custom event that I'm defining, which will be dealt with the delete something else method on my parent component. And the item is the input that I'm giving into my component. So why am I doing this? I mean, what is the reason to define the delete something method in our parent components? We wanted to keep our components as dumb as possible. As long as we could, some of the components that we wanted to reuse. We don't want them to have any kind of information. We just want them to know, I will give you something, and then when I ask you, just tell me that this event is going to fire. That allows us to reuse this component in so many different places. It's much easier to test, and we can give more than one function, and we can use it in different ways. So our delete component is taking an input with the input decorator, and we can intercept that and use it in many different ways. And we are able to define a custom event with the output decorator and emit any kind of event. When the delete action happens in our component, what we are doing is not to actually delete something, but to emit outside that I am going to delete, this is my job. When that action fires in my child component, my parent component has to be the one to decide what action is going to be taken. So in this case, this is where we are bringing back the store. This is where we are dispatching to our store, to our global immutable data, that this is the event type that is happening right now. And this is the second thing is my payload. This is the payload that you are going to get at the end of this action. The other very confusing part of working with Angular for the first time was using observables. And subjects. So effects kind of takes care of it, but we still have to learn some of the operators that are on observables. And if you try to learn all of them at the same time, it gets really complicated. But what I would recommend is try to learn just 3 of it this week, maybe, and then just learn 6 total, and don't worry about the rest of it. But the most important ones are map, and this is very similar to regular array map. It is only acting on one particular data that's coming next instead of the whole array. And merge map is a very useful one. It is taking 2 of the 2 observables and then merging them and returning one action. In this case, we are also defining the type of the action, and the type of the action is remove item, which was emitted by our parent component. And effects are where we are creating the side effects by making a HTTP call and deleting the actual item. Once we delete that, we also define another action. If the action is successful, we say remove item success, and if not, we are saying the item wasn't successful. Then the reducer can decide if to actually delete the item or not in the UI. So this is what our reducers look like. It's basically a switch case statement, and this is the easy part. When something is successful, then we can say we actually know for sure that we are able to filter this data. And each time we are returning a new object because we wanted to keep the immutability. That's why we are assigning a new object. So I can't decide if I should show you now, but there's an amazing tool, Redux extension, which I will show later. It really helps to understand these concepts when the things are firing and how the data is not changing. Well, structuring our application, the other thing that we got stuck a little bit was ng modules, like how to organize our code. Because there was not many examples, there still is not, for very big applications. It was a point of confusion for us. So we have share modules. This is kind of the obvious one, because anytime we have anything that's reusable that we wanted to use, like the delete component or any other kind of component, we wanted to use it there. But one confusing part is not to have the providers, the services there. The reason we don't want to include the shared modules, well, any services in our shared modules, services are where we keep any reusable functionality in a singleton object, and it is each time we are using it inside a component, we are getting a instance of the same service. But if we have the services, if we provide the services inside a shared module, that shared module might be imported inside a lazy load module, which creates a new service instead of getting the initialized version. So the problem with that is you might have changed some of the core functionality of something, for example, the HTTP response header or anything like that, and the last one that is being imported will overwrite the previous ones, and it is going to cause lots of problems. Instead, a good place to import any of your services or any of the things that you need inside your first render of your application. If you have a PWA, for example, application in your shell module, we can put all of these things into a core module. Footer and header and page not found is one of the good examples of the things that need to go in the first core module. And anything else that we might be using and that needs to be imported just once can go into core module. And shared modules can be used in any kind of lazily loaded modules, and this way we keep the core of our application very lightweight. So, as far as the tool goes, NGRX is an amazing tool. Well, the only thing that I would say you wouldn't be using it is when you don't have a complicated state, but most of us do have a very complicated state, and things get complicated very fast. If you're doing a demo, of course, don't just use NGRX, but if you are in production, most likely you do need to manage some state that is very important to you, and it's error-prone. But the good news is that you don't have to commit all in. You can just take a part of your application or a part of your very important state and use it with NGRX and then slowly add into it. And we have some example application on the NGRX repo and also our Narwhal repo. And Redux Debugging Chrome extension is the extension that I was telling you about. Let me show you very quickly. This one. So it is an extension to our Chrome developer tools, and it should work. Not here, maybe. Okay. What am I? Okay. So here I have I have the state of my data. It says the first action is the initialize our store, and the router updated, and I have a collection of books, and then they loaded successfully. So if I browse any books over here, there's a search event that's firing all the time, and I can click on those search events and then see what the query is at that very specific moment. And at the end of it, it gave me some entities. There were some books that came from that search, and I'm able to see all of the data, all of the actions, and the payloads of those actions, what came back from it. And I can see all of my states. This is my global state and everything we have at the moment. And the cool thing is I can also time travel. I can go back and forth, jump and skip some of the events, and see the changes on my states and actions, which is an unbelievable tool for debugging and knowing what's really going on in your application. So Angular CLI, we talked about it. It makes it really easy and fast. And just wanted to tell you a little bit about NX because it's related to using NGRX. We are making it very easy for you to create your first NGRX application so that you don't have to create all of these effects and stores and the actions, and have one first example of it ready for you so you can add to it. So NX works on top of the CLI. I mean, if you already have a CLI application, you can just use the ng-generate workspace to make your application an NX workspace. What it's using is the dev tools that I was telling you that Angular published, which is called schematics, which is a really interesting tool. And if you are, if you're not interested in using it, this is also a great tool to learn how to use the schematics, because as we did it for you, like, you can create your own build tools and own processes on top of CLI or Angular using the schematics. So generate workspace, what it's doing is creating a single repo which has some applications, because most of the big enterprise have more than one applications, and creates also the libraries. One thing I really like about this, I worked in a big company where we created applications, and then I get to build the same components over and over again, which is not so much fun, and it's really hard to keep track of or update. And what I tried to do for a long time was to have separate components, libraries. But there was a lot of setback on that, because nobody wanted to create another repo and then write the component there, dump components there, and then rebuild it and re-import it to another place. So what this system of keeping your apps and libraries inside one repo is that, at least for us, takes that mental block to make your dump components as libraries and reusable components. Also, when you have multiple teams working on similar, different parts of your applications, it's very easy to collaborate and know what kind of components or what kind of libraries you have, and to keep up to date. When it comes to NGRX, and as I said, this is all open source. You can check it out. You don't have to use it, but this is also a great learning tool. not only it sets up the application and then includes the debugging tool for you, just sets it up, and also adds some tests for you with RX Marbles. So RX Marbles is a great visual way of debugging observables and seeing what they're doing. And testing with it is not something that everybody does, but we make it very easy for you to do that right away. And a few other things that I wanted to mention is Angular CLI is doing a great job with a lot of things, but when it comes to merging and your localized files together, there's still something missing. I think it's coming, it's on the way, and NGX I18 support is a great tool for it. And lastly, Bazel is very much like Webpack, and it's being used by Google, and it's open source now. And what we are trying to do is to make Bazel compilation available to you so that your development time reduces. Because Webpack is amazing and it compiles really fast, but it still checks all of your files every time you change something, and we wanted to make that much faster. And you can find NX and take a look at the code on narwhal/NX, and I will post the examples to my GitHub as well. And you can find me on Twitter, iSomething, and narwhal.io. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you for your attention.